we're talking Canberra. 2CCC, we're talking Canberra.
A 2CC Tim Shaw podcast.
I had the opportunity of speaking to Ewan Gilbert before the 8 o'clock news. He was the fine ABC reporter that put together the Behind Closed Doors documentary that aired on ABC television here in Canberra, and it's also available for you to view on facebook.com/1206-2CC. You can watch that documentary on ABC iView if you just click there. Yesterday I spoke to the Minister for Women here in the ACT, Yvette Berry. She's working on affordable housing and also trying to protect those that are at risk in our community, particularly women and children. I asked for her to consider telling the Chief Minister to put the serious matters that were disclosed in the ABC documentary on the Cabinet agenda. The Cabinet will meet for the last time before the ACT elections to be held on the 15th of October. I also spoke to Acting Director General of Community Services, Dave Peffer. Now, Mr Peffer made it absolutely clear that his staff are committed to working in the best interests of all children at all times. And you'd expect nothing less from an Acting Director General of a very important part of our community services. Also spoke to ACT Senator and Federal Assistant Minister for Social Services, Senator Zed Seselja. It is National Child Protection Week, the 4th through to the 10th of September. And if you want to know detail about NAPCAN, NAPCAN, the National Child Protection Week, nothing can bring back Jakob Oakey. His grandfather, Alan, emailed the program yesterday and said, Tim, I am Jakob Oakey's grandfather. I appeared on the ABC program. I would like an opportunity to comment on some of the points made by Mr Pepper. I'm pleased to say that Mr Oakey is on the program now. Good morning, Mr Oakey.
Good morning, Mr Shaw. How are you?
Very well. Can I just say, sir, I am so sorry for your loss. Just tell us a little bit about your grandson. Tell us about Jakob.
Well, Jakob, I mean, it's easy for grandparents to say this, and I said this at Jakob's funeral, is that he was a wonderful boy. I mean, like all boys, he was hurtling around, rushing around, and naturally, because of, his mother's illness, he spent a lot of time with us. So we knew him very well. He lived with us, went to school through us a lot of the time. And he was a very accomplished sports person. He loved soccer and played soccer very well. However, tragically, whilst he was with us, he was diagnosed with a type 1 diabetes, and this was while he was sort of in his early teens.
Yes.
And that is very hard for any person to come to terms with diabetes, and particularly an adolescent who's had no such worries in the past and suddenly has to try and cope with and manage what is a life-threatening disease if not managed properly.
Yes.
And this certainly had its effect. And certainly the issue of his diabetes does permeate throughout the whole story of Jakob and his relationship and with not only ourselves and his mother, but also with the Care and Protection Services, because the Care and Protection Services were fully aware that Jakob had this condition, and they were aware, and they've admitted they were aware that they knew it was a life-threatening condition, and they were also aware that whoever had care of Jakob had to have, a really deep knowledge of how to deal with the management of diabetes, but also how to deal with emergencies.
This is a serious medical diagnosis. How is it, Mr Oakey, that Jakob went to Queensland? Who condoned his transfer from the ACT to Queensland?
These are the questions we're trying to find an answer to. And we're basically being met with a wall of complete and utter silence. We've taken the matter to try to get documents under FOI, and we find that what limited documents are being released to us are massively heavily redacted.
Yes.
The matter is currently before the ACAT, the ACT Civil Administrative Tribunal, and so I'm not sure how much I can say, but the fact is we've been met with very much a wall of silence.
Are they ACT documents that are redacted? Are they documents from the ACT government agencies that are heavily redacted that you as Jacob's grandfather can't even get the right answers and the full answers?
They certainly are ACT government documents, CPS documents,
Yes.
but they are also documents from the agency in Hervey Bay to whom the Care and Protection Service outsourced care of Jacob. Jacob's mother sought those documents as soon as we heard of Jacob's death. Jacob's mother sought those documents from Youth Care in Hervey Bay, and it is my understanding from a letter that was sent to my daughter from Youth Care's lawyers that the Care and Protection Service directed Youth Care to send all their documents down to Canberra so that they could be controlled from Canberra by CPS.
What would you like the ACT government to say to you, your daughter, today? What do you want the ACT government that are fully aware of this case? And Mr. Oakey, they plead privacy. They always say that these matters cannot be discussed publicly. Well, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable to you or to me or to the excellent program Behind Closed Doors. We are hit with brick walls all the time because they plead privacy. What's your response to that?
Well, my response to that is the one that I have consistently claimed, is that, yes, there should be protection for children. However, two things have arisen fairly clearly from our efforts to get answers, is that the care and protection, despite the fact that Jacob is now dead, despite the fact that his mother and his family are seeking answers, the Care and Protection Service is relying on privacy and other exemptions. Now, when it comes to privacy and these other exemptions, my concern is that they are in fact being used to protect the decision makers rather than protect Jacob's privacy. Remember, Jacob is dead. Tragically, nothing will ever bring him back. Now, if we're to get the bottom of the problems that beset Jacob and the CPS and their decision-making process, we have to get answers. Now, as long as they're refusing to provide any form of reasons, explanations for their extraordinary conduct in placing Jacob in a placement which they knew, and I quote the Director General's own words in CPS documents, would present a substantial risk to Jacob, this will continue happening. And they cannot be allowed to use the secrecy provisions to protect themselves.
There is that famous and important saying that when transparency is not apparent, the greatest disinfectant is sunlight. What are you calling on the ACT government to do today, Mr. Oakey?
What I'd like the ACT government to do is, and can I just preface this by saying, despite what might have been said by Dr. Burke about ministers needing to know about things before they can act, both the former Chief Minister, Katie Gallagher, Mrs. Birch, and Mr. Gentleman, and indeed Dr. Burke himself have known for some time, in fact, some years, of the problems that relating to Jacob and the what I have called the institutionalized culture of maladministration within the CPS, yet nothing has happened. So if I was to ask the government today what they should be doing, I would be saying there has to be proper, independent merits review of decisions by the Care and Protection Service, which is now renamed Children and Youth Protection Services. There has to be proper and well-funded oversight of the CYPS, and there has to be a situation where the CPS must be prepared to be accountable, and accountable publicly for its decision-making, because without this public accountability, the errors will continue and more children will be endangered.
Can I ask how Jacob's mother is, Mr. Oakey?
She remains completely distraught. I mean, and it's not something that, you know, it's happened and happened in the past. Even for me, Jacob is I still see him.
Yes.
I can look out the front of our garden and see him playing with his basketball.
Yes.
And I know this is the same with Jacob's mother. Jacob is still a reality, and particularly the pain and suffering of not only his death, which is traumatic for any family, no matter how a child dies, but in the circumstances where the death was so preventable. One of the most painful things I personally have, and I'm sure it's with Jacob's mother, is that we were completely powerless to help Jacob, because all decisions in respect of Jacob were being made by the CPS, and we were excluded. We told them time and time and time again that there were problems up in Hervey Bay, and yet they would not take any action to protect Jacob. I cannot put in words how helpless I felt when every time I tried to get the ministers, the Director General, Miss Howson, and others to step in and try and protect Jacob, and nothing happened.
You're fighting for justice for Jacob.
Indeed. And I have just recently found out, and this has been admitted, they probably didn't mean to do this, but this has been admitted by the Care and Protection Service, that there was a child concern report in respect of Jacob shortly before he attempted suicide in 2012, which substantiated the abuse Jacob was suffering. And yet even then, the Director General and the CPS did nothing to protect Jacob.
Sir, I've got the Minister on the line. I'm going to get him to respond to these matters. I'm calling for this urgent matter to be on the agenda for the last Cabinet meeting of this ACT government before they go into the election period. Sir, I want to thank you for your time. Will you please stay in touch? We want to be able to deliver anything that we can do for the Oakey family, seeking justice for Jacob, and I want to thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you. Alan Oakey's the grandfather of Jacob Oakey. If anything is concerning you at the moment, please consider ringing Lifeline 13 11 14. National Child Protection Week is 4th to 10th of September. If you want to know more, napcan, napcan.org.au.
We're talking Canberra, CYPS, we're talking Canberra.
A 2CC Tim Shaw podcast.
I'm pleased to say that Dr. Chris Burke is the Minister for Children and Young People here in the ACT. He's across the commentary that Mr. Oakey, the grandfather of Jacob Oakey, has just told us. He's on the line now. Dr. Burke, good morning.
Good morning, Tim.
We're not getting transparency and straight answers from the ACT government, according to Jacob Oakey's grandfather, Alan Oakey. What do you say to that?
Look, I'd say at the outset that any child's death is a tragic occurrence. It shocks and saddens both families and the community, and I know that from my own family's experience. What I would say is that it's very important to understand why we have secrecy provisions around caring for children and young people. It's because it's vitally important to protect the privacy and personal circumstances of those children.
Minister, Jacob is dead. Jacob is dead, Minister. His grandfather will not accept, and nor will this program, the inability of the... That is not acceptable. That is not acceptable. Chris, Minister, you have a responsibility to communicate with the members of the family. We have a grieving mother. We have a grieving grandfather and grandmother. They have had nothing but barriers from the ACT government. Privacy for Jacob has gone, Minister. It's in the public domain. What do you want to say to Mr. Oakey and his family?
As I was saying, Tim, if you were aware of the circumstances of families in these situations, you would be aware that there are always invariably other children whose privacy and personal circumstances need to be protected by the privacy provisions of the Children and Young People's Act. It is not simply possible to breach that act without hurting and harming other people.
Mr. Oakey is in receipt. Minister,
No child.
Mr. Oakey's in receipt of documents that they've received under Freedom of Information. His statement to me this morning is clear, that the ACT government has redacted those documents to such an extent that they can't even see clarity, and they are the direct family members. Sir, what are you going to do about it? Mr. Oakey demands answers, expects answers, and deserves answers. His daughter is devastated. What are you going to do as the responsible minister?
No child, as I said, Tim, wants its family circumstances discussed in the media, and I'm very clear about that.
That is unacceptable, Minister. It is in the public domain. It has appeared on ABC television in an extensive documentary. Mr. Oakey has contacted this program. Mr. Oakey is Jacob's grandfather. What are you going to do today? What are you going to do today?
Tim, you are only hearing one side
What
of the story
are you
here,
going to do
and what
today
I'm
to a
going to
grieving
tell you-
family here in the ACT, Minister?
As I said, Tim, child deaths are a tragedy. I know that from my own family experience. And what I'm also telling you is that the integrity of our child protection service, of the circumstances...
That is
of
unacceptable,
individual
sir.
children,
The child
You may
is
think
dead. The child is dead.
And
The
I'm
family
telling
are
you, Tim,
demanding
you can
answers.
assume-
Your government has redacted those documents to such an extent that Mr. Oakey can't even see the woods for the trees. Have you spoken directly to Mr. Oakey?
There has been considerable correspondence...
Have
with
you
Mr.
spoken
Oakey
directly to
through the
Mr.
government
Oakey?
solicitor's office. There is and I think one of the things that you're losing sight of...
I'm not losing
is-
sight of anything. We have a
is
dead
the
child that
role-
was the responsibility of the ACT government.
the role
You are
of
hiding
all
behind
the-
bureaucracy. Shine the light.
And you know that.
Shine the light on this and open the door, Minister. The child is dead. The family are demanding answers. Will you give a commitment on this program now that this matter will be on the agenda for the last cabinet meeting of this government before you go into election mode?
Thank you, Tim. And of course, the final cabinet meeting for the ACT government prior to the election is today, and
Yes.
I will be providing with cabinet with an update on the progress of issues, support structures and oversight mechanisms operating in the child protection space. You must remember also that we're 18 months into our $16 million 5-year step up for our kids reforms, which is of course supported by Cabinet. You'll also recall that there was $2.47 million in the current budget to improve oversight and quality assurance in child protection.
Don't tell me. Tell Mr. Oakey. You go to that cabinet meeting, you speak to your cabinet, and then I would strongly urge you to speak to Mr. Oakey. Thank you for your time, Minister. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm sorry that... but by the way, Tim, it's also Child Protection Week.
Yes, I know. I've noted that.
We're talking Canberra. 2CCC, we're talking Canberra.
A 2CC Tim Shaw podcast.
I watched a very important documentary on Friday. It was called Behind Closed Doors. It talked about failures in the ACT protection of children. The government not protecting children here in the ACT. I have been contacted by a relative of one of the young men that died. Jakob Oakey passed away at the age of 17 alone. Alan Oakey, his grandfather, contacted me. And I've also been contacted by many Canberrans concerned about what seems to be an inability of the ACT government to be able to manage these matters. I am a fair and reasonable man, and what I need people to do is to explain to me, in their own words, what they're going to do about things. I wrote to the minister responsible in the ACT government, but just by way of background, I want to take you back to my conversation yesterday with Dr. Chris Burke, the minister responsible in the ACT government. Here's what he had to say. We're not getting transparency and straight answers from the ACT government, according to Jakob Oakey's grandfather, Alan Oakey. What do you say to that?
Look, I'd say at the outset that any child's death is a tragic occurrence. It shocks and saddens both families and the community, and I know that from my own family's experience. What I would say is that it's very important to understand why we have secrecy provisions around caring for children and young people. It's because it's vitally important to protect the privacy and personal circumstances of those children.
Minister, Jakob is dead. Jakob is dead. Minister.
I can't-
His
I
grandfather will not accept, and nor will this program, the
Tim,
inability
that is
of
the
the...
most
That is not
offensive
acceptable.
and
That is not
statement
acceptable.
because
Chris,
you're-
Minister,
Tim,
you have a
should-
responsibility to communicate with the members of the family. We have a grieving mother. We have a grieving grandfather and grandmother.
Tim, if you
They
let me
have
finish.
had nothing but barriers from the ACT government.
Tim,
Privacy for
Tim.
Jacob has gone, Minister. I spoke to Dr. Chris Burke yesterday. That's just a part of the conversation. If you'd like to listen to the full interview, go to 2cc.net.au, the podcast. I wrote to Dr. Burke yesterday. Dear Minister, thank you for your time on the 2CC breakfast program. The Oakey case is distressing. I feel for the family, as I know you do. Any fair-minded Australian would too. Mr. Oakey and the family deserve a personal call and a face-to-face meeting with the Minister. They seek justice for Jacob. Redacted documents from the ACT government have rendered the family unable to put this sad series of events behind them. I am glad that this matter is before the ACT Cabinet. That was yesterday. As at 6 p.m. last night, the Oakey family had not received a call from Minister Chris Burke, had not received a telephone call from Dr. Chris Burke. It's that simple, isn't it? Here we have a situation where the ACT government is arguing secrecy and the protection of the detail regarding the child. The child is dead. Nicole Lauder is the MLA and the member for Brim-Debella, Shadow Minister for Family and Community Services, Housing Environments and Arts and Tourism. She said the child protection here in the ACT, the failures are a disgrace. She's also calling for Chief Minister Andrew Barr to remove Dr. Chris Burke over the child protection failures. Nicole Lauder is on the line now. Good morning, Nicole Lauder.
Good morning, Tim.
Tell me why you want the Chief Minister to remove Minister Burke from this position.
Oh, I think you referred to the discussion yesterday as disappointing. I thought it was disgraceful. I thought it was disgusting. And there needs to be much more done to protect vulnerable children and to ensure that, relatives such as Mr. Oakey and Jacob's mother as well are kept informed and given the right information.
What shocked me when Alan Oakey contacted me was that the level of documentation that was provided under Freedom of Information was so redacted, Nicole Lauder, and blacked out, could not understand for the life of them the documents that were provided under Freedom of Information. You seem to have no difficulty speaking to a grieving family. You spoke to Mr. Oakey as far back as February this year.
I did. And as a result of that, back in, I think it was March, we called on the government to broaden their review into systemic level responses to family violence. That was directly as a result of Mr. Oakey's representations to me. But he'd been in contact with members of the government and indeed members of the opposition in the previous assembly, in that family's desperate attempts to get action in the case of their child, Jacob.
What concerns me is this buck passing, it seems, Nicole Lauder. I recognise and respect the fact that Dr. Burke was not the minister responsible for the ACT government at the time of Jacob's death, but you know and I know that when you are the responsible minister, the buck stops with you. Why do you believe Dr. Burke is so reluctant to simply pick up the phone, organise a meeting and to sit down as constituents here in the ACT? Don't they deserve the ear of a minister to be able to directly express their concerns, Nicole Lauder?
I think so. As an elected representative, it is your role to represent members of your community, and it is important to talk. I'm concerned that this particular portfolio of family and community services has revolved from one person to another in the Barr Labor government. Over the past 3 years, there's been at least 3 different ministers. I think it was Birch, Gentleman, and now Dr. Burke. It's a revolving door of ministers, and obviously no one is really interested or committed to this portfolio, and it's going, through one after the other. That's why we're not getting the correct oversight, the correct attention in this really important portfolio.
702 children currently under the care of the ACT government. We've got a dead child here and we can't even get a minister to pick up the phone and speak to the family. If you were the minister yesterday and you were on this program, and not at my urging, but at the urging of the family who have come to the media, the family have had no satisfactory answers from the ACT government. I get you as the minister on the phone yesterday. Would you have picked up the phone and spoken to the family?
I'd like to think I would have spoken to them before I spoke to you.
I think so.
I don't think you would need to urge me to speak with them. I would have done that already.
What needs to happen in your view and the view of the Canberra Liberals if you're able to form government after the 15th of October? What do you intend to do as the minister responsible?
Well, there's a couple of important things that I think that we will do that we're very committed to doing. Firstly, we won't have another independent inquiry because there's been inquiry after inquiry over more than a decade. What we will do is implement the recommendations of these reports, not just keep having another inquiry. That's the first important point, to implement the things that have been recommended time after time after time. Secondly, we would sit down with a public advocate and others with oversight responsibilities in the system and work out exactly what they need, because obviously there are things falling through the cracks. Sit down with them, understand what's required to make sure that they can review the cases from care and protection system. And thirdly, we'll have an effective minister who's committed to looking after the care and protection system. If that was me, I'd be honoured to do it, but whoever it is from the Canberra Liberals, you can be assured that it's not going to be a revolving door of ministers.
The future of Australia depends on our children. If we cannot protect these children and if we cannot in a transparent manner, and as Mr Oakey is calling upon, transparent decision-making processes relating to children in the Director-General's care, legislatively based independent external reviews by ACAT of the CPS and CYPS decisions under the Care and Protection chapters of the Children and Young People Act. Hiding behind legislation is not what a minister should do. He or she is an elected representative and you are the voice of the people. We need good public servants here in the ACT to be able to run these departments. But if ministers aren't getting the answers and the people involved aren't getting the answers, who's running the joint, Nicole Lauder?
That's a very good point. And, we know that confidentiality is important for protection of children, but it's not there to protect decision-making. It's not about secrecy. It's about protection where that's required. But for too long, I think organisations and perhaps public servants have hidden behind confidentiality as a reason for not sharing information, and that's just not good enough.
I want to thank you very much for your time, and do stay in touch with this program. I know that Mr Oakey appreciates your efforts, and if only the Minister would pick up the telephone, organise a meeting and to sit quietly without the shine of the media. I'm tired, Nicole Lauder, of the media being blamed for causing the problems. It is the government themselves that failed to communicate to a family, and they have sought remedy through the only way they can, which is the voice of the people, and I'm pleased to be part of it. Nicole Lauder, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Nicole Lauder is the Shadow Minister for Family and Community Services.